All right, well, let's get into it.
Chapter 1, Postmodernism, Questioning Knowledge and Power. In the 1960s, a radical new way to think about the world and our place in it was introduced in France. Leading figures behind this new way of thinking were Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Jean-François Lyotard, among others. Although most people in the English-speaking world probably haven't heard of these French theorists, the change they inspired, postmodernism, revolutionized social philosophy, the study of society and the institutions and human relationships that form it. Over the decades, postmodernism has not only dramatically altered what and how we think, but also how we think about thinking itself. It has led many people to question how we know what we believe we know, and even if we can truly know anything at all. Whoa. So what is postmodernism really? The online Encyclopedia Britannica defines it as a late 20th century movement characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism, or relativism, a general suspicion of reason, and an acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. Postmodernism first appeared in the arts around 1940, but by the late 1960s it was in the humanities and social sciences, including fields like psychoanalysis, linguistics, philosophy, history, and sociology. The early thinkers in these fields drew from their precursors in surrealist art, revolutionary politics, and anti-realist philosophy. Anti-realist philosophy says that while the real world might be out there, there's no meaningful connection between it and our claims of knowledge about it. Knowledge is just ideas expressed in words, not reality, or even a truly meaningful description of reality. Since we're focusing on the aspects of postmodern thought that have been applied to the real world and become socially and culturally powerful today, this chapter won't be a complete summary of postmodernism. We'll highlight some of the underlying themes of postmodernism that drive today's critical social justice activism, shape educational theory and practice, and dominate our current conversations about social justice.
All right. So I think there's a good stopping point right there.
It's not a complete coverage of postmodernism. That's something that postmodernists will use to throw sand in your eye and say, it's never a complete idea because there's a million different ideas inside of postmodernism. And that's just true. Here's the bottom line. There's no postmodernist that will ever be with your description of it or a summary of it unless you include the entirety of postmodernism, which is a million different books. I usually like to make some sort of joke, call it like Schrodinger's theory or something like that. It's Schrodinger's cat. It's there, it's not there, depending on different quantum physics ideas. But if you agree with the postmodernism, they say that's what they said. If you disagree with it, they didn't say it that way. It's more nuanced than that. That didn't happen.
It's the having your cake and eating it too.
But beyond that too, a lot of it was really nonsensical in different ways. But I'm not also going to say there was no good ideas or interesting ideas in all of it. But the original people, for sure, it was just so impossible to read and to get through. That's also another one of the areas where they can endlessly say, I don't think you understood that exactly right, because they probably didn't either. I remember going
to the Matrix too.
Exactly. That comes from postmodernism. All of that.
The scene, he just uses like words, like he just throws in apropos, like randomly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, Neil. Who are you? I am the architect. I created the Matrix. Ergo, some of my answers you will understand, and some of them you will not. Concordantly, eventuality, mathematical, assiduously, inexorably monumental. Inevitability, a consequence of varying grotesqueries. Ergo, bullshit.
It's like the most powerful tool in their toolkit is polysyllabalism.
But that whole movie comes from Baudrillard. But Baudrillard was asked to be a consultant on it, and he said no. He turned him down because he said they didn't understand his theory correctly. And so a bunch of people will point at how the Wachowskis didn't understand postmodernism correctly. But it doesn't matter who you are. You didn't exactly get it.
There's a seed in this first section that I think is worth really exploring, because for me, once this clicked with me, I understood a little bit more what I was facing when I dove into postmodernism. And that is where they mentioned that these philosophers built on work and events that happen in the realm of art and literature. And there's a video called Why Art is So Bad. And I was watching the video, and we'll get to it in a second, but one of the comments on the video was that the entire reason that art is so bad is because nobody wants Hitler to not get into art school in the future. Because there's this idea that Hitler was a young artist and he wanted to get accepted into the prestigious art school. And so he submitted his portfolio of work, and they acted as a gatekeeper. They looked at his work, they said, no, you're not accepted in. And so it was then that resentment of being kept out of his desire because he felt like his talent entitled him to that position. And so his resentment then festered, and it blossomed into the ideology that led to the Holocaust and World War II and everything. But there's that point where he's rejected. His art is not good enough for the established art world. And
They're
so
sort of advocating for a no Führer left behind policy on that? Or?
that's a great turn of a phrase. Then the idea is when some sort of establishment has standards and criteria, those standards and criteria act as, on one hand, gatekeeping, on the other hand, a form of oppression. Because in the realm of art and literature, there may be some truth to this, because art and literature are subjective. And who's to say what is art? But at that point, who's to say what is art wasn't really the touchstone of the artist movement. And there's one moment in, I believe it's the 1940s, that art historians will say transformed the landscape. And I want to play a video that kind of showcases that and see what you guys think.
In 1917, Duchamp was on the jury for the Independence exhibition in New York, being a very famous young artist. Just before the exhibition opened, this porcelain urinal arrived at the gallery, signed by R. Mutt and with a label with the name and address of a female friend of Marcel Duchamp's. There was a tremendous row about it, and it was decided that they wouldn't show this object, and it was hidden behind a curtain. Duchamp, who had not said he had anything to do with it at the time, immediately resigned from the committee, and there was a lot of publicity about it in the newspapers. But the most interesting thing, of course, was the second issue of the little journal that Duchamp edited with his friends Henri Perrochet and Beatrice Wood, called The Blind Man. And this second issue of The Blind Man was sort of focused on this question, the exhibit that was refused by the Independents. It lists the reasons for rejecting Fountain. It says some contended it was immoral, vulgar. Others, it was plagiarism, a plain piece of plumbing. Now, Mr. Mutt's Fountain is not immoral. That is absurd. No more than a bathtub is immoral. It is a picture that you see every day in plumbers' show windows. Whether, and then this is the key paragraph, whether Mr. Mutt, with his own hands, made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, created a new thought for that object. That was a very new idea, and that's probably been one of the most influential sort of moments or gestures in the whole history of 20th century art. There are really several different ways of taking the gesture of removing a urinal from its normal position, turning it upside down and presenting it in a different way. Either you see it as a fundamentally iconoclastic gesture, or you see it as a rather new take on the machine aesthetic. And I think both of those positions are perfectly plausible.
Okay, there were a couple of things that struck me in that video. If you think about the evolution of art, I feel like there was a time in history where art was defined by the master who had perfected a certain set of skills, and you had traditional mediums, whether it was sculpture or painting, and the quest was to perfect and improve upon those skills so that you could replicate the real world in a way that was one foot rooted in tradition and another foot rooted in innovation, but they were bound together by this idea of excellence and improvement. And then you start to get a redefinition in the realm of modern art about what exactly that means. And you get things like Impressionism and Cubism. And then you have this idea of that's not accessible to everyone because not everyone is a master and not everyone wants to pursue that life of a master. But then all of these people, both who are the artists as well as the people who purchase and justify the art industry, they act as gatekeepers to what can be considered art. And so by changing art from this quest to acquire skills and competence into a quest for how we can subvert ideas, it just changed what the nature of art was. And it challenged the institution of art that includes something as almost transparent of selecting what is worthy of being in an exhibition, because that's an expression of power from that perspective, because it's these people who get to choose these things who basically shape the landscape for it. And so in the realm of art, you could see then how you could say, some people said that urinal was profane or vulgar. Now, saying that something is vulgar versus saying that it's normal and acceptable is another type of filter, another expression of power in what we're exposed to. So you go from a world that values competence, proficiency, excellency, and honing of skill to a world now that says that we want to subvert norms because norms themselves are an expression of power. If something is normal, then it's oppressive because it prevents you from expressing and being the full range of things. Now, in the realm of art, there's some value to this. So some of the things that have come subsequent to that urinal do have the power to show contradictions in society, to open your mind to looking at things a different way. But this all exists in the realm of something that is inherently from the beginning subjective. And I feel like that idea of, well, what's normal, what's acceptable, who is the gatekeeper, who is the authority that defines those things, was questioned first by this act of this urinal. And there's probably other artistic endeavors that were preludes to it asking the same questions, but this is the one that made the biggest impact. But then that idea transcended the world of art and literature and found its way into how we interact with very real non-subjective things in the realm of politics, in the realm of science.
Yeah, there's value in it in the art world. There's concepts that are interesting with playing with it. And like I said before, I think that's true of some of what the postmodernists are saying about everything as well. It's a lens. Lenses are okay to put on for a bit. Like any sort of lens, you're supposed to be able to put it on, take it off, maybe have a different lens, that sort of thing. And you can expand the way you think about things, and it can have value and interest, especially in the art world, in the world that's already abstract.
I think that shows how ill-equipped the more conservative types are to criticize art, because calling the urinal vulgar is just such a dumb move. Because it's like, you can explain very easily why you don't consider it art, why you don't consider it creative or anything like that. But to call it vulgar, that only, I don't know, I've been an angsty teenager before, and anything my parents called vulgar, I was like, yeah, this has got to be, there's got to be something to this. But it reminded me of, I don't know if you ever saw it, there's this dude that went to an art gallery, and it was years ago. I think there's types of people who are able to explain why something is beautiful. And everyone wants to be that person. And everyone wants to pretend that they saw it too at the same time. So if you explain why the urinal is beautiful, there's going to be a whole group of those artistic vultures who are just like, yes, I understood that. That makes a lot of sense. I was thinking the same thing. And you get this dude went to an art gallery and he took his sunglasses and just set them in the corner around of the art gallery. And you can see he had his camera and he'd take pictures of people just gathering around it, interpreting what it meant and stuff like that.
17-year-old kid who went into the San Francisco Contemporary Museum of Art, and he walked in, and so what did he do? Took off a pair of glasses that he was wearing and stuck them on the floor. And then other people walked around and assumed that it was art. People started gathering around these spectacles that he'd left on the floor, and they felt that it was an exhibit, and they started marveling on it. And this thing, he tweeted it out, and it went incredibly viral. It's literally a pair of glasses that he just stuck on the floor in front of the wall, and people were down there photographing it and marveling over the artist's vision, literal and metaphorical. He's clearly cocking a snook, which is a phrase, at the art world and saying this is all pompous, pretentious nonsense, and yet at the same time, actually is maybe stumbled on something that's reasonably half profound insofar as Anything creative is arguably art if it causes us to think about things in a different way, or causes us a moment of reflection on who we are, our place in the universe, or just to see an everyday object. I mean, I think that's part of the problem. When you have urinals in a contemporary art museum, and you walk around and say, it's a urinal, I see it in the toilet. Yeah, but you don't see it in a museum. Or you see literally a blank white canvas, and it's just on the wall, and it's like, wow, that's a blank canvas. I could have done that, but you didn't think to do that. And so it's about the concept, the perception, the execution, and what it evokes in us, the observer. And that's when you start to disappear down this very pompous, pretentious kind of spiral, and you end up kind of contemplating your own navel for far too long.
Some people just figured out, oh yeah, they'll just listen to you if you say complicated, where if you just project with confidence why you think this urinal is beautiful and artistic, then people are going to follow along. Oh yeah.
The thing that immediately jumps to my mind listening to that story is just even the fact that you said that people are looking for beauty, that in and itself is a form of gatekeeping. And that the idea that art has to be beautiful now it's like this solid pillar that now needs to be broken down, because why does art have to be beautiful? Why can't art that is vulgar be justifiable in its own right because of its vulgarity, because that vulgarity will open up new ways of conceptualizing the world and art itself. Why do we think that something is vulgar? And that's where this line of thinking then leads you down to the world now, where we have art that is intentionally, explicitly, and politically profane, where it identifies things that people hold as sacred and intentionally tries to basically turn it into crap or equate it to crap.
There's another level, but too, and you'll get some people who defend this thing, and they say that he was throwing a holy hand grenade into the middle of an orthodoxy. But some of those same people will get upset that these guys did that into another orthodoxy when they threw in a holy hand grenade doing the Sokol experiment.
Oh, that's a good point, because in some sense, him submitting this and then publishing the article where he exploded up the idea of what is art really, because art as a subjective thing should be completely open to different expressions of it. Whereas the Sokol affair or the grievance studies affairs, where they submitted these fake papers, they submitted the papers not to a authority that is supposed to be open and subjective, but to authority that is specifically supposed to not be open and subjective. It's supposed to dig through, critically analyze, and try to work through human biases to try to pursue some form of shared objective reality truth. But by then taking something that is nonsense and tossing it up against that filter, and then seeing whether or not the filter would actually filter it out, was a challenge of that filter. Is it standing up to its telos? Is it actually doing what it's supposed to be doing in terms of moving our understanding of truth and knowledge closer to real truth and discarding things that were false? And that, like you said, is holy hand grenade. It blew that up because it revealed that those systems don't actually do that. All right. So I do want to make sure that we watch this, Why Art is So Bad. I don't know how much, I'm going to have to filter out any parts that are from PragerU, but I thought the video was so good just in terms of iconoclasm is this impulse that exists throughout history where you want to tear down things that are in power. And there's a form of iconoclasm in ideology that is at the root of postmodernism as we're seeing it now. But the art way of perceiving it is just so tangible. I think it's important to look at.
The Mona Lisa, the Pietà, the girl with a pearl earring. For a score of centuries, artists enriched Western society with their works of astonishing beauty. The Night Watch, the Thinker, the Rocky Mountains. Master after master, from Leonardo to Rembrandt to Bierstadt, produced works that inspired, uplifted, and deepened us. And they did this by demanding of themselves the highest standards of excellence, improving upon the work of each previous generation of masters, and continuing to aspire to the highest quality attainable. But something happened on the way to the 20th century. The profound, the inspiring, and the beautiful were replaced by the new, the different, and the ugly. How did the 1,000-year ascent towards artistic perfection and excellence die out? It didn't. It was pushed out. Beginning in the late 19th century, a group dubbed the Impressionists rebelled against the French Académie des Beaux-Arts and its demand for classical standards. Whatever their intentions, the new modernists sowed the seeds of aesthetic relativism, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder mentality. Today, everybody loves the Impressionists. And as with most revolutions, the first generation or so produced work of genuine merit. Monet, Renoir, and Degas still maintained elements of disciplined design and execution. But with each new generation, standards declined until there were no standards. All that was left was personal expression. The idea of a universal standard of quality in art is now usually met with strong resistance, if not open ridicule. Here's a test I give my graduate students, all talented and well-educated. Please analyze this Jackson Pollock painting and explain why it is good. It is only after they give very eloquent answers that I inform them that the painting is actually a close-up of my studio apron. I don't blame them. I would probably have done the same, since it's nearly impossible to differentiate between the two. Not only has the quality of art diminished, but also the subject matter has gone from the transcendent to the trashy. Where once artists applied their talents to scenes of substance and integrity, from history, literature, religion, mythology, etc., many of today's artists merely use their art to make statements, often for nothing more than shock value. Artists of the past also made statements at times, but never at the expense of the visual excellence of their work. It's not only artists who are at fault. It is equally the fault of the art community, the museum heads, gallery owners, and the critics who encourage and financially enable the production of this rubbish. It is they who champion graffiti and call it genius, promote the scatological and call it meaningful. It is they who, in reality, are the naked emperors of art, for who else would spend $10 million on a rock and think it is art? Let's celebrate what we know is good and ignore what we know is not. By the way, the white background behind me is not simply a white graphic backdrop. It is a pure white painting by noted artist Robert Rauschenberg at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art.
So, thoughts about the video? No, I'm not showing this video to say that I think that I agree with everything that he says, because I actually disagree with a lot of what he says.
What do you mean?
Both of us, I know Jared plays music, I play music, surely some rock and roll. There's a lot in rock and roll that mixes the two, the sublime, the beautiful, and the terrible. There can be beautifully destructive things that also have a lot of craft in them.
I think in terms of this video, like where I disagree with it is it does make you think that there is an aspect of art which is about skill, craft, and competency. And that's part of what art is. But then there's the other side of art, which deals not only with aesthetic and beauty in one dimension, but also deals with ideas and meaning in another dimension. And if you only look at art as its worth and value is defined by its skill and its craft, without looking at the meaning, I'm sure there's a better word for it, but beauty or aesthetic or meaning, then I think you're going to miss a lot of what is valuable in art. I think confining it to just the one dimension of craft is going to deprive us of a lot of worth in the art. Now, the other side of this is he uses the example in figure skating where there are experts in the field who are able to judge objectively through a subjective assessment, but there's expressions of artistic movement. And he used the example of figure skating. The games of each of these worlds is different. In figure skating, they're talking about your form in executing things that already have a clear definition. And the skill and talent that you bring is your ability to replicate those moves and do so gracefully. And so that's something that you can rate. But how do you do that with art? He used some profane examples, one of them being the Virgin Mary out of cow dung, the other being the squatting enforcement officer. But I'm sure you could find somebody to articulate eloquently why there's some sort of profound meaning in each of those things. Again, that's subjective. So some people will say that whatever expression of meaning there is pointless and it's actually vulgar or otherwise. But where the danger lies in taking this type of lens and translating it into the real world is if you then say being a doctor doesn't require all of those years of education and medical school And we should be able to just have the students be the doctors and do those things, because having professional societies that require certification, that's just the system trying to oppress newcomers and people who don't have privilege by keeping them out of the club that is able to charge exorbitant fees. And so there's this iconoclasm to that. There's this pushback against the system that exists in that. But if you carry it through and you say, okay, that's what we're going to do, and you tear down the systems, then you're left gutting a profession where competence, proficiency, and being gatekeeping is vitally important, because it is able to make sure that best practices are employed and that you have people who know what they're doing in the system. And you can say this is just a ridiculous thought experiment, but in the Cultural Revolution of China, that's exactly what happened. In these universities, the people who were the doctors, who were the trained professionals, were categorized as Black name individuals and Black name professionals. They were the bourgeoisie because they had the capital, they had the control of these institutions that were oppressive to the proletariat. And so they ran struggle sessions on these doctors. They took, if you were a doctor who was the head of a department, then you would find yourself cleaning toilets rather than doing surgery. And the nature of this being flipped on its head was brought out in dramatic form in one of the films depicting the Cultural Revolution, where the wife of one of the Red Guards is about to give birth, and there's a complication with the birth, and they need a doctor because the students have no idea how to handle that.
得去问问大夫在哪儿，咱得给凤霞找个好大夫啊。
嘿，哪儿找大夫呀？都关牛棚了。这儿早被护士学校的护理小将给夺权了。
没大夫。哎，同志，你们妇产科有没有大夫？
我们就是啊。
我是说老一点的。
哦，老的那都是反动学术权威，都被打倒了。你放心，你爱人的情况很好，有我们在，没问题。
二喜啊，我还是不放心。咱凤霞是个哑巴，跟别人不一样啊。你说这些年轻人能行吗？
得想办法找一老大夫来啊，哪怕他在那儿待着没用呢，咱心里也踏实。
哎，这得从牛棚里带一个人出来。我想想办法。
And the only way they're able to get a doctor to try to come help is they have to go to the makeshift jail where they put all the actual trained professionals after struggling sessions, and they can't even get that doctor to help because he's been starved so much that he can't help.
爹，没有，这就是妇产科的王教授，这是他头一把手。万一有点什么事儿，您给帮个忙。
哎，还是带着好，带着，带着。
新凤霞家属，新凤霞家属，男孩7斤2两，
生了？
怎么一点动静没有就生了？
不是跟你们说没问题吗？
娘，是凤霞生了吧？生了，
生了个男孩，母子平安，7斤2两了。
哭的声大着呢。
在里。
快来啊！产妇大出血，止都止不住，大出血止不住了，怎么办啊？止不住了，快来啊！怎么办？快来啊！这该怎么办啊？怎么办啊？快想办法！ 这到底该怎么办？
你慌什么？赶快想办法呀！
我们这学生，我没处理过，我不会呀。
行，把他给叫来。啊，对。
对，王大夫行，他是教授，他会，他一定会。王大夫是教授，王大夫会。
都给你快把王大夫叫。王大夫
怎么了？怎么一下成这样了？
坏了，他吃了。先拉回去，走。氧气在哪？
王大夫。
王大夫怎么样？
不行，还是不行。
不用动我。氧气。
我就这一个女儿嘛，我就剩这一个女儿了，大夫。
And it's a heartbreaking scene. But when you talk to survivors of the Cultural Revolution, this is part of the dimension of taking that, I don't know if there's a word other than iconoclasm, or taking that transgressive idea from the art world and translating it into the world where there are professions where you need standards, you need to be able to divide the masters, the proficient, from those who have not attained that level of competence.
Those things are not just the Chinese Cultural Revolution. That same thing happened in Russia. There's a funny scene about it in the movie Death of Stalin.
All right, comrades, now that we're quorate, I propose we call a doctor.
All the best doctors are in the gulag or dead.
Yes, because they tried to kill the boss.
So any doctor still in Moscow is not a good doctor.
What are people's thoughts on getting a bad doctor?
What the fuck are you talking about? That's mad. What if he recovers and finds out? Well, if he recovers, then we got a good doctor. And if he doesn't recover, then we didn't, but he won't know. What was the name of that woman who gave evidence against the doctors?
Tomarchuk.
Yes, she's got everything we require for this situation. The location of all the remaining doctors in the Moscow area, a proven desire to survive, and a talent for fellatio.
Right, she gets my vote.
Yeah, good. Let her find us some doctors.
Yeah, and if it goes badly, we pin it all on Lady Suck-Suck.
Then we shoot her.
Yes, that would work.
You see? We're better as a committee. Let's go on.
That's just a great scene, and it's showing how when you allow politics and ideology to interfere in the world of competence and professionalism,
it's happening now. They're removing all sorts of testing to get into schools. The testing must be removed because that's a gatekeeping situation, because they've been far too stringent in the past, and they haven't opened up their minds to different ways of, how do they call it? They say they use different ways of knowing, but different ways of approaching problems, and that identities might have more use than skill in arenas that we probably all would prefer skill. Kenny Zhu on Twitter talks about it a whole lot. There's been like some recent documentaries about it.
The program was, you had to score pretty close to the cutoff score. You had to attend a summer program. It's like an alternate means of admission.
But de Blasio manipulated it.
Asian students they're kicking butt on every other group. They're kicking butt on whites. They're kicking butt on everyone.
They went around and they saw, okay, where are the predominantly of the Asians located? Because we don't want to include them in the discovery. We want to exclude the Asians.
We have schools that's predominantly Asian. Those schools were excluded.
It's designed specifically to decimate the Asian enrollment.
For the life of me, I don't understand how a single black leader could be against a process that says that not 9%, but 45% of your children will be able to get in a specialized high school. That is mind-boggling.
Man, if you don't realize in the 21st century that affirmative action is deeply problematic for black people, is injurious to the dignity of black people, you're not paying attention. I'm an economist. I would like to win the Nobel Prize in economics one day. I doubt that it'll happen. But if it did, it'd be a good thing. It'd be a great day in the Lowry household if I did. But damn it, it would be worth nothing if the committee that awards Nobel Prizes had been picketed by Black Lives Matter for 6 months before they awarded it to me, demanding that a black American be given the Nobel Prize in economics, which has never happened. So here's my statement. Keep your hands off of my honor. Let me achieve or fail on my own merit. Then when I achieve, it will have redounded to my benefit because I will have achieved it on my own merit.
But actually holding to those standards, it's one of the ways that people can move up into those positions through their merit, even though that's such a bad word. And it does a better job of it when it's not subjective. It does a better job of selecting across different identities. There's nothing saying that this identity or that identity can't be the person who's able to meet those objective standards.
My uncle, 1932, a child of sharecroppers, took the test for Stuyvesant High School. He passed, but they made him take the test twice. He took it twice, and he passed it twice. They had no choice. They had no choice but to let him attend. I know in 2019, kids of color can pass this test. We can.
So on the art thing, in Jordan Peterson's latest book, his first rule is do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. And I feel like that's what I was saying about how the conservative types are very ill-equipped to deal with creative achievement because they're constantly going to denigrate it or whatever. And then on the flip side, you got the modern art. You've got their side of it is that only creative achievement, that's the only merit in art, is if it's a new idea, if it's shocking or whatever. And then on the other side, you've got, well, that it has to be aesthetically pleasing, it has to obey these rules or whatever. And I think that's part of why this postmodernist stuff takes a foothold, is because the people on the other end of it are so bad at explaining their side of it.
Beyond explaining it, they also devalue the art, and they don't understand what a big role in society it plays and what a big deal it is. And they just let it go and don't realize that just from that realm, it starts taking over everything from the cultural realm.
Chris, you mentioned that this doesn't just exist in the world of visual art, but also exists in music. And we see discussions around this where there's like this really big pushback against jazz when it first came out. And it violated all these different established traditions of how song structure, chord structure, tonality is supposed to be expressed in the form of music. But we've seen certainly a great deal of very beautiful music comes out of that. But just like in the visual world, there's an extreme of this that people probably look at the same way they might look at that urinal, and that is atonal music. And I found this really fun song by Merle Hazzard that I thought exemplified that. I wanted to share that with y'all.
The majority of the music that we listen to in a Western culture is tonal music. That is, it's centered around one tonal pitch. So, for example, if your piece or your work happens to be in E major, it means that, generally speaking, your first chord will be E and your last chord will be E, which establishes a comfortable beginning and end for the listener. A common example of tonal music would be Beethoven's Für Elise, which sounds like this. It's pleasant to the ear, and it's going to return to a tonal home.
I dedicate this song to my father. My dad was a composer, modern was his style. His music always made you think, it never made you smile. He wrote for chamber orchestra, now and then for voice. Tonality in Daddy's world was just another choice.
If, however, we're working with atonal music, this deals with music that was written without a tonal center. There are varying degrees of how extreme this can get, all the way from a strict serialism down to some more loose patterns that the music might follow.
Del Papa's compositions came in rigid 12-tone rows. There was no tonal center to the music he composed. He was a lover of complexity, some have said pretense. His music wasn't joyful, it was just abstract and dense. Give him some, Allison. That's right. Since dear old daddy left us, life has been so hard. There aren't enough musicians who embrace the avant-garde. No one plays atonally, they're home or on the stage. I miss Igor Stravinsky, my dad, and old John Cage. Give me some of that old atonal music, like my daddy used to write. It was hard to sing if you rehearsed impossible by sight. Emotion is for simple folk, art should be arcane. Some compositions feed the heart, my daddy's fed the brain.
That was fantastic.
Do you know what that John Cage joke is?
I was going to ask you guys because you guys are more musical than I am.
He has a song called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. That's just 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. And he says that, no, it's not silence. It's actually the sound that the audience makes when they're expecting music. That's
that banjo solo was fantastic. My God, I haven't seen
It's funny because there's this thing where you focus on proficiency, craft, and skill, and you refine it. And then there's this phase, I feel like, in music that is being expressed in this song where somebody like his daddy is so focused on technicality, proficiency, structure that they create something that is really complex, but would be written down and annotated, and it would follow certain highly technically proprietary form and structure. There's still some aspect to it where, yes, it doesn't have a tonal center, but it still follows these rules, and there's a sophistication to it because of that. And in art, maybe you could say that was like the modernist phase where the people were doing this, but then you get this separation between the audience, the high art and the low art. And that dimension where and they even talk about it, like in that song where not everybody's going to accept the avant-garde. The avant-garde for this moment was people who could appreciate that, even though it didn't have a tonal center, it still followed these rules. And so you had to be sophisticated and educated to understand that. And then you would say that is high art, but then you'd have the Bud Light drinking audience who like doesn't understand any of that stuff. They don't care about any of that stuff. And they're offended that you're calling that music. And the way that they would almost push back against that would be like, I don't know, Skrillex. Or something where you could just take something that it sounds like chickens screaming, but we're bringing it in a way that the mass audience appreciates it without having to understand the technicalities that may go into that atonal music because it follows those particular rules. And that's going to be what's popular and what hits and what spreads virally. And then you have everything that goes on from that. I'm not saying Skrillex was that moment in music, but it's almost like you get things so specialized, so esoteric that it divides. The general public can't appreciate it. The sophisticated academics hold it up as that's high class. And then you have to disrupt that division between high and low class. And that's where we are in that.
There's such a zeitgeist of it because NPR's Song of the Year last year was that WAP song.
You've heard it.
You want to say it? It's wet ass
pussy. I'm talking wop, wop, wop. That's some wet ass pussy. Macaroni in a pot. That's some wet ass pussy. Huh.
The NPR said it was their Song of the Year. So there's some sort of level where they have to turn around and pretend to even turn things like that into something this is an interesting take on music. It's an interesting thought experiment on it. But in the world of art, like I said, there's some sort of level of, if you bring up Peterson again, of like chaos and order and chaos and order. And in that world, there is some value in stuff going nuts. And then it makes you appreciate the thing when it goes back to order and then goes nuts and back to order. And there's a cycle. And that same sort of cycle is not so something to appreciate so much when it comes to maybe architecture, if you really care about the foundations of the architecture, or if it comes to medicine or
art's kind of the perfect medium. Music specifically is a perfect medium to talk about this, because I listened to that. You talked about listening to some Destiny, and I don't know if you ever heard his debate with Eric Stryker, the dude who's like an actual like white separatist, like a legitimate racist. And he starts talking about art, and he's trying to act the only good art has been, you know, contributed by white people, basically. And he names the high art as being like classical, Mozart, Beethoven, stuff like that. And then he starts trying to make fun of jazz, which doesn't go over well because Destiny actually knows a lot about music.
When you go see a symphony, where does the music come from? Who are the composers? They're Italians and Germans and Russians.
What are the most popular forms of music that America is known to export to the world?
Yes, and that's not culture.
That's rock and roll, hip hop, rap. Where do these come from primarily? So this is a this is a loser topic. You have to go to high
culture.
You have to go to another subject besides music, because it is the worst example you could have picked. Like, jazz is one of the most important contributions that America's made on the world stage.
Jazz is a bastardization of the waltz. That's what jazz music.
Wait, would you say that every single form of art is a bastardization of the art that it was derived from? You realize that every single, like, would you say that Romanticism was a bastardization of classical music, or that classicalism was a bastardization of Baroque music, or that Baroque was a bastardization of the
So you're saying
this is ridiculous.
So you're saying
it's like the worst topic you could have stumbled on. Like, I'm literally a music major.
He basically tries to paint jazz as that atonal thing we just listened to, and how it's just people making stuff up as they go. No, there's an improvisational section in a lot of jazz music, but jazz is highly complex and very structured, and it's like...
Well, every extreme has its opposite, because if you read Theodor Adorno, the founder of the Frankfurt School, large portions of his work was making the same complaints about jazz music.
Hey, Mr. Adorno, I read your dissertation, and it sent me to a state of agitation. I reckon some of your thinking is right on about the commercialization of the jazz song. I reckon just about anyone can see I was just another victim of the culture industry. But all that stuff about inevitable castration and your disembowel, it's an oversimplification. You know everything there is to know about consumption. All those effects, your political, your economical, your ideological, your psychological, and maybe methodological, but it's based on assumptions.
I think just the thread that's being woven through all these different pathways, through art, through music and everything, is that skepticism and subjectivism and relativism clash with structure and order. And it's really, when you go down this line of thinking, you're really favoring that relativism and skepticism about authority, about what actually defines competency and proficiency and things like that.
That musical example is really helpful, especially a little bit about music, about decentering and what are rules. Like those two, if you could sum up postmodernism as fast as you possibly could, I'd say both of those two things, because that includes both Foucault and Derrida. But we're going to get more into that.